I'm going to give a brief overview of the woke ideology from the perspective of astrology, which I've covered in more detail in previous videos, such as what is a woke Jupiter and the 7 layers of self-identity. This is a response to a recent comment on the channel that gave a couple objections to those videos, and I want to make those objectives to what we call woke as clear as possible. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about how identity politics, as we know them in the 21st century, they can end with a very simple realization and understanding about how spirituality actually works, regardless of what your religion is. So the commentator, Navy Pink Design, says, "I would love to see your take on the anti-woke movement through astrology, because these videos seem awfully biased and don't seem to be based on actual lived experience of woke ideology, just generalizations. Maybe I'm wrong and you have been there. Would be more convincing if you shared that." Well, first, you don't have to have personal experience with something to have an opinion. It helps to have personal experience, but it's not required. I've never lived in a communist dictatorship, but I have an opinion on communist dictatorships. But regardless of that, I'm going to give a little bit of my personal experience with woke in a couple minutes and what you can learn from it. But first, let me explain why woke, from the perspective of astrology, basically exposes it as a silly, ahistorical, and apsychological take on reality. There have been many definitions of woke, but you have to first remember that they were called social justice warriors until that title became so toxic and very specific that it was transitioned into the more general term woke, meaning that it's a person who has woken up to systemized oppression, which exists, but not in the way that social justice warriors describe it. And there are many branches and sub-agendas in the world of SJWs and woke ideology. But here are 3 core assumptions that they make, which essentially is the bedrock of this ideology. So one is humanity is broken up into 2 groups: the good guys or the good gals, the good people who are called oppressed, and then the bad guys, the oppressors. So that's number 1. Number 2, what makes you a good guy or a bad guy depends upon immutable characteristics of your physical body. And number 3, being a good guy or a bad guy is both historical and will be eternally present in the future, as well as the present, obviously. And these categories, the good guys and the bad guys, the oppressed and the oppressors, they have always existed and will always exist. In other words, the good guy and bad guy categories are static and they will never change. So the possibility of a good guy becoming a bad guy because of their behavior is ontologically impossible in this worldview, meaning that it can't happen because their immutable characteristics can't change, therefore being a bad guy can't change or being a good guy can't change. So taking these base assumptions, woke then makes more detailed claims, and the most prominent being is that a warrior for social justice is seeing that society is unjust, which is caused by Western European Christian civilization thriving at the expense of the rest of the world, at the expense of all the other civilizations. At its core, it's very important to understand that the woke movement is about power, and their fundamental goal is to overthrow the current power structure, which they define as Western European descendant Christian nations and Christian-dominated nations, so including the United States, and then replace that system with literally anybody else. That's the goal. That's the power goal. But the key is that at the end of the social justice revolution, when European Christians and any of their descendants are no longer have power in the world, they're still the oppressors. They're still the bad guys. And those who have the new power, say they become the majority, they're still the oppressed. They're still the good guys. Because of that third assumption, that this dynamic, this dichotomy is static and will never change. And it's been that way since the dawn of time and will never change at any point in the future. So I could continue dissecting woke theology, this metaphysical claim to reality that they have. I could do it really all day long, but it does make me kind of frustrated, and I don't dwell on it because it is very frustrating. It's like talking to a brick wall. If you try to talk to someone like that, you have to essentially move on. But to understand from an astrological perspective, you have to understand this basic description I just gave. That core foundation sets everything else up. And woke ideology as we know it wouldn't exist without those three assumptions and then that base foundation. So woke theology is saying that your immutable physical characteristics are locked into your identity, which then determines your beliefs. And then more importantly, your identity determines your behavioral patterns, whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. So that opens up a larger discussion, which is, okay, what is identity? How do we form an identity? The woke claim on identity is that immutable characteristics create it and they're locked together. It will not change. But for me, this opens up a discussion. So how do we create an identity if I reject that premise? I've heard of other theories. There are many other theories describing what creates our identity. And I had heard one that was very captivating that had 4 different components to it. And the more that I contemplated it, I realized you could succinctly and very neatly create 7 layers of how we create our identity, which resonate with the 7 visible planets. So if you follow this channel, you'll know that the planets, while they exist outside of us, they are forces within us that are the foundation of what we call human nature. So their unique characteristics form how we think and move through the world beyond our basic animalistic instincts, even though our animalistic instincts are related to the planets as well. For instance, Mars is our ability, it's the force within us, to respond to emergencies, either a fight, flight, or freeze. So we're not separated animalistically in that way. The better our Mars is, the better we're handling emergency situations, as well as in-group preferences, the desire to be around people who think similar to us, which is the Venus force within us of forming quality and long-lasting relationships with other people. But more importantly, the planets or the forces of our consciousness influence our ability to connect to the non-material fabric of existence. So these are subtle vibrational forces within and outside of us that help us develop a spiritual understanding of life that exists beyond the material creation, and then come to understand what happens to us after death and the meaning of life as we live it as a human being. And that'll come into play in a little bit when I talk about the spiritual dimension that woke theology just doesn't have. So we create our holistic sense of self-identity, starting with the outer 7th layer, which is our immutable characteristics, which are genetic tendencies, the genetic makeup we have, our racial complexion, our gender, our physical strength or lack thereof, and anything that relates to our raw physical body. And this layer is ruled by Saturn. The 6th is our cultural heritage and daily customs based on our physical location, geographically, as well as our familial relationships, and this layer is ruled by Venus. So how we relate to other people, as well as the cultural norms that we grow up with, which is based on where we're born in the world. So the 5th layer is our belief system or our worldview, including our philosophy and our religious understanding. And this layer is ruled by Jupiter. The 4th layer is our language or our ability to speak, write, and read multiple languages, and that's ruled by Mercury. The 3rd layer is our actions, which includes our career and what we do to define ourselves, and that's ruled by Mars. The 2nd is our interpersonal psychology and ego, the understanding that we are a completely unique person because we think differently than every other person, and that's ruled by the Moon. And the first layer is our soul, that we exist before and after our physical body was born and then dies, and that our soul is not confined to the material world, that our soul lives beyond this identity, all of the other layers of this identity. So it's the purest layer of who we actually are, and that's ruled by the sun. Now this model works because it's fluid, meaning that all of the layers interact with one another, and they're going to influence one another, but they're still independent and unique ways to create and claim an identity for yourself. Also, we can emphasize one layer more than another layer, such as saying, I'm from Switzerland and my Swiss customs are extremely important to my understanding of myself. That would be the sixth layer, the Venusian layer, such as, say, the food I eat or the holidays that I celebrate because of where I was born geographically. Or I am what I do, which is the most important thing to me. Say I'm very charitable. I help people out when they need it. I am a lawyer, a mechanic, a firefighter, a garbage person. That's what I do, and that is the third layer of Mars. Or you could say my personality and my preferences make me who I am. That would be your inner psychology, and I share that with no one else. That's the second layer. Well, a woke person would say, my skin is this color, and that skin color group is what makes me who I am. And a new way of saying it is, I'm neurodivergent, saying my brain chemistry is flawed because of X, Y, and Z, and that makes me who I am. And that's emphasizing, again, a biological reality or a biological characteristic as being the major informer of one's basic identity. So it's very important to understand that we have each layer and they all interact in a dynamic and personal way. Some layers are more important than others, and etc. What woke ideology is taking that top layer, that first layer, the Saturnian layer. Saturn is the planet of our limitations. We're ultimately limited by death. And again, things that we can't change in life and therefore have to just deal with. That's what we have a Saturn for in our life. Woke takes that immutable characteristics layer and says that this is the most important layer, if not the only layer. And this is what determines how much power we possess inherently, how we are able to gain more power in the hierarchical society that we live in, how much power we're born with, what determines our access to resources, and what determines essentially our moral compass. That layer determines it makes assumptions about all of the other layers, but that is the most important layer. And that's what makes woke theology so crude, is that it foregoes the complexity of history, the changing of peoples and the movement of peoples and the dynamics of belief systems history. It just throws that away, and it throws away the complexity of human psychology as well, and especially the religious and spiritual dimensions of human psychology, such as the idea of having a soul, the spiritual dimensions of realizing you have a soul, and it's completely fatalistic and biologically determinist. You're either a good guy or a bad guy. Layer one is the most important thing we should all be focusing on. So at the end of the day, this theology is all about power and then dehumanizing a perceived enemy because of their physical characteristics. And this is nothing more than biological determinism. And I discussed that in my video, how the woke ideology resurrected the Frankenstein of biological determinism. So now I'll briefly talk about my experience with woke, which to me really isn't all that important. It's more important to, discuss what it is, and we've all had to deal with it in one way or another. But I'll just talk about one situation, and then I'll be able to relate that to the astrological perspective even more, because that's the real more important thing, and how identity politics will disappear with that spiritual understanding if it's taken more seriously. So I lived in New York City for 8 years after graduating from university, and I always had 2 and sometimes even 3 jobs to pay the bills. And at one of my jobs, I got fired, and I was replaced by, it turned out to be a black lesbian who actually trained her in the position beforehand. And she was actually a friend of mine, and we would go out after work and things, and we were good friends. I'd never heard from her after I got fired, so it is what it is. And my firing was planned in advance by other members of the staff, female members of the staff, I'm assuming. and I'm suspicious that it was, because you could kind of sense it in the air as it was going down in retrospect. And so the management, they created a situation so they could fire me for a technical work-related mistake. I had to sign documents to say I wouldn't sue them, and they had it really ironclad. It was a very well-organized way to get rid of a person. And I'm sure many people have dealt with that, and it was really tough at the time, but it's important to take from it is that when you're not wanted somewhere, why would you even fight to stay there? So you weren't bitter about it, and when you lose a job, you learn to see it as a way of freeing yourself, no matter how difficult it is materially at the time. So after losing that job, I was looking for a new job. And I distinctly remember scanning the listings in the job directory, specifically in the arts, in theater and museums and institutions, as art assistants in photo labs, in art studios, etc., those kinds of things. And I'll never forget the day I'm looking through the listings and seeing over and over again, we're looking for a Latina or a Latinx with a person with marginalized ancestors or an immigrant for this position. Or seeing black queer applicants for this black institution are the only applications we're accepting. Or, which was the most common, we're prioritizing marginalized groups in this application. That's who we're looking for. And it was just constantly. And I remember that day seeing, like, there's maybe one of these 65 jobs I'm seeing that I'm actually can go for because of something I can't control. And all of them were identity-based in some way, shape, or form. And even if it was a call for submissions for things, we're calling for artwork or plays or film ideas for this, but it has to be about this identity politics thing, and 80 to 90%. And it got so disheartening. And even if it wasn't specific at the bottom, it would always mention something about identity politics. And so my only option was really, I can just pretend that I'm gay, which I wasn't going to do, because that's really all I could do. And again, if they don't want a person like myself, that just is what it is. I'm not going to fight my way into those positions and tell them that they're wrong. They just don't want a person like me there. And I'm not going to fight them for what they want. That's what they want, even if it is illegal. I'm not going to try to change other people's opinions in that way. But you have to understand, it was very frustrating. And this was in like 2015, 2016. It's very difficult and frustrating because it doesn't matter what skills you have, and it doesn't matter that you could perfectly fit into that role, what ideas you could bring, and having confidence about how you could help out the organization, and realizing I have all this previous experience, and the effort and sacrifice I'll do to fit into this role could be super helpful to these people, and I could tell them all about it. Just put me in an interview and I could show you. A huge part of that art world in Manhattan and Brooklyn, it was based on that first layer of identity. And it's arguably the least important layer of identity because it's by definition something you can't change. You have no power to change it unless you fake an identity. Be someone who you aren't. Put on a mask in that sense. So that was, say, 10 years ago, and you just have to adapt to learn to the circumstances, which is what I did, and not let other people's opinions of you about things you can't change affect you. So I just kept paving my own way, doing the projects that I was already focused on and most inspired to do while working these other side jobs, and just foregoing the idea that I was going to break through to get a well-respected position at some institution and to pay the bills easier. So I've always been very independently minded and sometimes stubbornly independent. So just focusing in on your own path and making things work for yourself despite those kinds of obstacles. So when you see this woke, and that was, I guess you could call the beginning of it, that era when it started to crescendo and it became a lot bigger. When you're seeing this major trend, and New York City being at the kind of epicenter of it at that time, and maybe even today being the epicenter of this kind of ideology, you get this sense that this kind of worldview is never going to last. And that I've got to get out of this toxic identitarian atmosphere, because eventually, if you're looking at the world in that way of looking at the world, it'll have an effect where it kind of destroys you from the inside out, and it's eventually going to collapse. And I personally am not going to condemn myself to running up a muddy hill, fighting to survive in a society that's hostile to me because of something I can't change. So you just have to get wise to the situation. And my response, some people, their response is to fight it. And that's a good response too. My response is, it's too far gone, and I got to think of another way to do this. So now what made my reaction to the situation even more surreal is that in 2016, I discovered the Vedic literature, and first with the Bhagavad Gita and then the Srimad Bhagavatam. And then from there, I wrote, directed, and produced the first live action film in English based on that ancient text, which I released in 2020. And a side story to that was when I was talking to a young lady one night with my friend who's from Iran, and he took me to a Persian party. It was a Persian themed event. And we went to it, and we're hanging out, and at the end of it, she asked me what I do and everything, and I said, oh, I'm making this movie based on this text from ancient India, and this is what it's about. And this is the philosophy of it, which is that we have this soul, which I'll get into in a second. And the soul is not defined by your current body. We're something deeper. She says, well, how are you able to do that? You're a white guy. You can't make a movie like that. And I said, well, if I was Chinese, would it make a difference? It's about the philosophy. So they just don't get it. They can't see past the first layer. They can't see what's beneath. And it's just a flaw in a way of thinking. So anyway, the core message of the Vedic literature is that we all have this divine soul within us, and that we live our present life to fulfill experiences that our soul desires to have. And when we die, we still hold material, and when we die, if we still hold material desires within us, we're born again in a new life to live them out, to satisfy those desires ad infinitum, until we learn to remove material desires from ourselves on a soul level, and therefore we do not have to be born again. So finding myself in this woke atmosphere before the idea of woke really became concrete, I took it upon myself after learning this. I'm going to make it my mission to bring this teaching into the Western world because it felt so unknown and underrepresented. This is what can help people get out of that mind trap and way of thinking, to see the bigger picture of it, to see the spiritual reality that our soul lives many lives and that we may live many more, and we're not confined to a single identity category, let alone a single identity, having lived multiple lives, and that we've likely and almost certainly have lived lives in multiple races and multiple contexts, and our soul does that in order to live very specific experiences to get an experience of what the material world offers us. So it's an extremely expansive worldview rather than this reductive worldview. And the more you contemplate it, the more you see, the more you become at peace with your current life circumstance and deciding what you can and can't change in your own life. So we could have been a Mongol and had that experience to live as a warlord. We could have been a Japanese woman to live an experience of what it's like in medieval Japan. We could have been born as a slave, as an African slave on a slave ship, or a random poor Londoner in the Victorian era, or say a rich aristocrat in the Islamic Golden Age. Our past lives are not contained, or they're not restricted to a specific race, gender, or time period. So if we look at our current lives from that perspective, instead of seeing differences based on our immutable characteristics, or even over-identifying with your larger singular current personality of all the layers, you begin to see that the most important layer is the first layer, your immortal soul, and that because we all have immortal souls, we're actually all the same. We're all a piece of divinity walking around and having unique lives. And we're all struggling or succeeding in our current experience to develop to the best of our ability that first layer of identity formation, that we are a divine, immortal soul on a journey to realize the purity of our truest identity, of that reality of the soul, and that we are all one piece of God, a droplet in the ocean of consciousness, of everything. So that is what waking up really is. The ability for self-empowerment to use your will to change your life based on the information that when you die, your soul lives on, and that all of your struggles have a purpose to develop yourself spiritually. And you can choose to fulfill those realizations, or you can choose to ignore those realizations, that everything has a purpose to help us grow and to develop the best you can that first layer, and to work from that first soul layer outwardly. So my thesis for, say, an anti-woke movement from an astrological perspective, as the commentator mentioned, first, it's not to be anti-woke, because don't define yourself by what you're not anti, but take the expansive view on what your self-identity really is and realize the complexity of it and get a deeper definition of who you really are. So as far as the woke movement is concerned, I would have a lot more respect for them if they just said, we have to revoke the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and we have to be able to legally discriminate. We have to be able to legally discriminate against people in employment and housing because of their immutable characteristics. That's what they're doing, but they don't say that. I wish they would just say that, because it would be more out front. Yeah, we want to do this. We're doing it, but we're kind of hiding behind the oppressor dichotomy. But if they would come out and say it, and if they actually would try to repeal it, and they successfully repealed that inability to discriminate, it would backfire in all these different ways that they wouldn't like. But at least come out and say it. If that's what you are doing and that's what you really want, just be honest about it. But my solution is different. Rather than trying to just expose the woke people, other people have that duty to them, and that's what they want to do. But my solution is to show the philosophical flaws in the philosophy from a spiritual perspective, which is denying the soul's journey through many personalities in many different lifetimes, that even non-woke people can learn from. You don't have to be woke to not understand it. Even, not people that don't subscribe to that ideology can learn from that. And that our current life is informed from our past actions from past lives. And I've talked about scientific studies about showing the reality of past lives, but that's an entirely another topic and an entirely another video. But it's real, it's a reality. And that's how spirituality works. And our current life is formulated from those past experiences. And the Vedic literature expands upon this philosophy in profound ways that so many other belief systems just don't do. And that's why it's so important to at least take a look at what it's been called Hinduism. But that's not what they call themselves. That's a bastardized word. That's a word that was made up when the British colonized India. But the Vedic worldview was the original philosophy. There's only one spiritual system, and that worldview is describing it. Eventually, in our current world, now we have all of these branches and all of these different worldviews that have their take on spirituality. But in my opinion, the real root of how spirituality works is contained in the literature of ancient India and what the Vedic worldview really is. So my final point is that through astrology, we can learn about our strengths and weaknesses in this current physical form we have, and then learn to master these forces at work within us, and learn to see ourselves in this larger context, and do the best we can to master our human nature, and choose to harmonize ourselves within the context that we're born in, realizing some things we do have the power to change, other things we don't have the power to change. And then basically astrology is a spiritual, it's a spiritual science that helps us get to the roots of who we really are. And learning about the planets, learning about all of the components of astrology. But that system of 7 layers of our self-identity it matches very closely to how we can then see how we create ourselves, an identity for ourselves. And the more we learn about each of those planets and each of those layers, we get this rich understanding of who we are. We get this more complete understanding of who we are, and ultimately a deeper spiritual understanding of who we are.